Have you ever wondered how a man who could buy almost anything in the world could still lose sleep over an empty dinner table? What if I told you that one ordinary meal served inside one of America's most heavily guarded mansions would trigger a chain of events that no amount of money could control? This is the story of Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old self-made billionaire whose name appeared on magazine covers, financial television programs, and lists celebrating the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the country. People admired his success, envied his fortune, and dreamed of living the life he seemed to enjoy. They saw the private jets waiting on airport runways, the sprawling estates overlooking the ocean, the luxury cars lined up like museum pieces, and the billion-dollar companies carrying his name across the business world. What they never saw was the silence waiting for him every evening when the meetings ended, the cameras disappeared, and the mansion became far too large for one lonely man. The people surrounding Ethan were always asking for something. Investors wanted larger returns. Executives wanted promotions. Reporters wanted exclusive interviews. Strangers wanted photographs. Some wanted business opportunities, while others simply wanted access to his fortune. Very few wanted Ethan himself. Then, on a quiet evening that looked no different from hundreds before it, a newly hired chef placed a single plate in front of him. One bite stopped him cold. That meal awakened memories he had buried since childhood, and before long, Ethan would risk everything he had built for the woman who prepared it. Yet the greatest danger wasn't waiting outside the gates of his mansion. It was already living inside them. The woman he trusted most wasn't who everyone believed she was, and the truth would leave an entire family fighting over billions. Before we go deeper into this remarkable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this remind us that behind extraordinary wealth are often deeply human struggles that never make the headlines. While this story is told using fictionalized names and dramatized conversations to protect privacy, it draws inspiration from real-world accounts of wealthy entrepreneurs, family disputes over inheritance, unexpected relationships across social classes, and the emotional cost that often accompanies enormous success. It is a story about trust, loneliness, ambition, and the surprising places where love can appear when least expected. As you listen, ask yourself one question. If you had everything money could buy, but no one you could truly trust, would you really consider yourself successful? Ethan Cole believed he understood exactly how the world worked. He believed every problem had a solution. Every obstacle could be overcome through determination, and every challenge could be managed with careful planning. He had spent years proving those beliefs were true. But he was about to discover that the human heart follows rules that wealth can never rewrite, and that one simple meal could begin a journey leading to secrets hidden for decades, betrayals from the people closest to him, and a decision that would change the course of his life forever. The story begins not with a billion-dollar business deal or a glamorous celebration, but with an ordinary dinner that became the most unforgettable meal Ethan Cole would ever eat. The public believed they knew Ethan Cole. Every financial magazine seemed to carry his photograph at least once a year, usually standing beside another billion-dollar acquisition or smiling confidently as he announced the launch of another groundbreaking technology company. At just 34 years old, he had accomplished what many entrepreneurs spent an entire lifetime chasing. Television analysts praised his business instincts. Investors competed for his attention. Universities invited him to speak about leadership, innovation, and the relentless determination that had transformed a young software engineer into one of America's youngest self-made billionaires. From the outside, his life appeared almost flawless. He owned a breathtaking mansion overlooking the California coastline, traveled aboard his private jet whenever business called, and employed hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the empire he had built from nothing. To millions of Americans, Ethan Cole represented the ultimate success story, proof that discipline, intelligence, and hard work could still produce extraordinary results. Yet every evening, after the board meetings ended and the final phone calls were returned, the applause disappeared. His mansion, magnificent as it was, became painfully quiet. Its towering ceilings echoed with silence instead of laughter. The dining room, designed to host dozens of guests, was occupied by only one man sitting at one end of an impossibly long table. Every expensive painting, handcrafted chandelier, and polished marble floor only reminded Ethan that luxury could impress strangers, but it could never replace genuine companionship. Money had solved countless problems throughout his life, but loneliness remained the one challenge that refused to accept payment. Few people understood how deeply that loneliness had shaped the man behind the headlines. Ethan had lost both of his parents before his 25th birthday, just as his first company was beginning to attract national attention. Instead of celebrating his success with the people who had sacrificed everything to help him reach that point, he found himself attending funerals and making difficult decisions alone. As his businesses expanded, so did the number of people entering his life, but the larger his circle became, the harder it was to know who truly cared about him. Some relationships ended the moment he refused to write another check. Others disappeared after discovering that winning Ethan's trust was far more difficult than gaining access to his wealth. Eventually, he stopped trying. Romance became another business risk he preferred to avoid. He convinced himself that staying emotionally distant was safer than risking another disappointment. His employees respected him, but few dared to know him personally. Even inside his own home, conversations rarely lasted longer than necessary. Meals arrived on schedule, staff performed their duties flawlessly, and everyone quietly returned to work. It was an efficient system, but it felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. Everything began to change after Margaret, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the Cole family for nearly 20 years, announced her retirement. She had known Ethan long before the fortune, before the interviews, before the security teams, and endless business meetings. She was one of the few people still willing to tell him uncomfortable truths, and before leaving, she offered one final piece of advice. She insisted that the mansion didn't need another famous celebrity chef or someone interested in serving extravagant meals designed for magazine photographs. Instead, she recommended a young woman named Emma Brooks, whose reputation came not from luxury restaurants, but from preparing honest, unforgettable food that reminded people of home. Ethan barely listened. To him, hiring another chef seemed like another routine decision delegated to his household manager. He signed the paperwork without reading much beyond her qualifications and returned to reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had no idea that one signature on an ordinary employment form would become one of the most important decisions of his entire life. Emma Brooks arrived quietly on a rainy Monday morning, carrying little more than 2 suitcases, a collection of well-used family recipes, and years of experience working in small restaurants where customers valued warmth more than presentation. Unlike many chefs hoping to impress wealthy clients with rare ingredients and elaborate techniques, Emma believed that the most meaningful meals came from understanding the person sitting across the table. She spent her first day observing the mansion instead of trying to change it. She noticed untouched bottles of expensive wine gathering dust, formal dining rooms that felt strangely empty, and a kitchen equipped with every modern appliance imaginable, but somehow lacking the comforting atmosphere she had always associated with cooking. The other staff members warned her that Mr. Cole rarely complimented anyone, rarely smiled, and almost never finished an entire meal. Most chefs lasted only a few months before resigning. Emma simply nodded and continued organizing the kitchen. She wasn't interested in impressing a billionaire. She only wanted to prepare food she could be proud of. That evening, Ethan returned home later than usual after another exhausting day filled with negotiations. He expected another expensive dinner that would taste technically perfect, yet emotionally forgettable. Without asking for anything extravagant, Emma prepared roasted chicken with herbs, creamy mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and a homemade apple pie. It looked almost too simple for a billionaire's dining table. Ethan barely glanced at the plate before taking his first bite. Then something happened that no employee inside the mansion had ever witnessed. Ethan stopped eating. He slowly placed his fork on the table and stared silently at the meal in front of him. His expression changed from polite indifference to complete disbelief. The taste had carried him back more than 20 years to a small family kitchen where his late mother used to prepare nearly the same recipe every Sunday evening. It wasn't merely similar. It was astonishingly identical. Every seasoning, every aroma, every tiny detail awakened memories he believed had disappeared forever. For several long moments, the billionaire simply sat there, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. When he finally called Emma into the dining room and quietly asked where she had learned to cook that exact meal, her answer raised even more questions. She looked directly into his eyes and calmly replied that the recipe had been passed down through her family for generations, and she had never met Ethan Cole, or anyone from his family, before accepting the job. At that moment, neither of them realized that one ordinary dinner had just opened the door to a mystery capable of changing both of their lives forever. The question stayed with Ethan Cole long after dinner ended. He had built an entire career on recognizing patterns, solving impossible problems, and identifying details that everyone else overlooked. Yet nothing about that evening made sense. His mother's recipe had never been published in a cookbook. She had never owned a restaurant, taught cooking classes, or shared her handwritten recipe journal with anyone outside the family. After her passing, Ethan had personally packed away her belongings, including the small leather notebook where she carefully recorded every family recipe she had ever created. He remembered locking that notebook inside a cedar chest in the attic of the mansion, unable to look at it without reliving memories that still hurt years later. So how could a young chef from another state prepare a meal so identical that even the smallest flavors matched his childhood memories? The logical side of Ethan's mind searched for simple explanations. Perhaps it was nothing more than coincidence. Maybe countless families prepared similar meals without realizing it. But something deep inside him refused to accept that answer. It wasn't just the ingredients or the cooking techniques. It was the feeling the meal carried, the comfort it awakened, and the unmistakable sense that his mother had somehow been present at the dinner table again, if only for a few precious moments. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself thinking about someone other than business long after the workday had ended. Over the following weeks, an unexpected routine quietly developed inside the mansion. Ethan, once famous for skipping meals or eating alone while answering emails, began rearranging his schedule to make sure he returned home before dinner. His executives noticed the change almost immediately. Evening conference calls became shorter. Business dinners at exclusive restaurants were politely declined. Investors who had once enjoyed unlimited access to his calendar suddenly found themselves waiting until the following morning. Rumors spread through his corporate headquarters that the billionaire had become obsessed with a new health program or hired a world-famous nutrition expert. No one imagined the truth was far simpler. Ethan wanted to know more about the quiet young woman preparing his meals. Emma Brooks never treated him like the richest man in the room. She never asked questions about his companies, never mentioned magazine interviews, and never appeared impressed by the wealth surrounding her. Instead, she spoke about fresh ingredients, farmers' markets, her grandmother's recipes, and the belief that food had the power to heal people in ways medicine sometimes could not. Their conversation started with recipes, but gradually expanded into stories about childhood, family traditions, favorite books, and the small moments that often mattered more than extraordinary achievements. Ethan couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without expecting something in return. The rest of the household noticed the transformation before Ethan recognized it himself. Staff members who had worked there for years whispered quietly in the hallways about how different their employer had become. The man who rarely smiled now occasionally laughed during dinner conversations. The executive assistants who once avoided interrupting him after sunset discovered he no longer answered work messages immediately because he was still sitting in the kitchen discussing homemade bread or family recipes with Emma. The formal dining room, once used almost every evening, slowly gave way to the warmth of the kitchen itself. Instead of eating beneath glittering chandeliers surrounded by priceless artwork, Ethan often preferred sitting at the large wooden island while Emma prepared the next day's meals. For the first time since moving into the mansion, the kitchen began to feel like the heart of the house instead of another perfectly designed workspace. Even Emma seemed surprised by how naturally their friendship had grown. She remained professional, careful never to cross personal boundaries, but she could see the loneliness Ethan had hidden beneath years of success. She understood that beneath the tailored suits, billion-dollar negotiations, and carefully controlled public image was a man who had forgotten what genuine human connection felt like. Then, just as peace began settling over the mansion, strange events quietly disrupted that fragile happiness. It started with an unmarked envelope delivered to Ethan's corporate office. His assistant assumed it contained business documents and placed it on his desk without a second thought. Inside were 3 photographs of Emma Brooks. One showed her entering a small grocery store several months before joining the household staff. Another captured her sitting alone on a park bench reading a book. The third showed her standing beside an older man whose face had been carefully scratched away until it was impossible to identify him. There was no letter, no explanation, and no return address. Ethan dismissed it as a cruel prank and instructed his security team to investigate, but they found nothing. A week later, another envelope arrived. More photographs, different locations, still no message. The pictures suggested someone had been watching Emma long before she ever accepted the job at the mansion. This time, Ethan didn't tell anyone. Not Emma, not his staff, not even his head of security. Something about the photographs felt deeply personal, as though whoever had mailed them wanted only him to see them. He locked them inside his desk and tried convincing himself they were meaningless, yet the questions refused to leave his mind. Days later, another envelope appeared, this time waiting inside the mailbox at the mansion itself. Ethan opened it alone late that evening after everyone else had gone to bed. His heartbeat slowed as he removed a single photograph from inside. It showed Emma standing outside what appeared to be an old farmhouse somewhere in the countryside. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood the same unidentified man from the earlier photographs. But once again, his face had been deliberately destroyed before the picture reached Ethan's hands. On the back of the photograph, someone had written just 5 chilling words in black ink. "She never told you everything." Ethan stared at the message for several minutes, uncertain whether he was looking at the beginning of an elaborate deception or a desperate warning from someone trying to protect him. Either way, one thing had become painfully clear. The woman who had brought warmth back into his lonely home was carrying a past she had never shared, and somewhere beyond the walls of his mansion, another person knew exactly what that past contained. The answers Ethan desperately wanted were getting closer, but so was a truth that threatened to change everything he believed about Emma Brooks. The photographs changed everything. Ethan Cole tried convincing himself they were nothing more than an attempt to manipulate his emotions. But every time he looked at Emma across the kitchen, calmly preparing another meal with the same quiet confidence she had shown since her first day, the anonymous messages echoed in the back of his mind. He hated the suspicion growing inside him because it felt unfair. Emma had never lied to him as far as he knew. She had never asked for expensive gifts, never used his influence for personal gain, and never behaved like someone chasing a billionaire's fortune. Yet Ethan had spent too many years in business to ignore warning signs simply because he wanted to believe the best in someone. Every successful company he had built depended on asking difficult questions before trusting appearances. If someone was watching Emma long before she entered his life, then there had to be a reason. For the first time since they met, Ethan found himself studying her expressions, listening carefully to every story she shared, wondering whether each smile concealed something she wasn't ready to reveal. It was a painful realization because, despite everything he had achieved, trust remained the one investment he could never afford to lose twice. Unable to silence the questions any longer, Ethan quietly hired one of the country's most respected private investigators, a former federal investigator named Daniel Mercer. Daniel had spent decades uncovering financial fraud, corporate espionage, and hidden identities. His reputation rested on facts rather than assumptions, and Ethan instructed him to investigate Emma Brooks as discreetly as possible. Days passed with no updates, allowing Ethan to hope the investigation would prove the photographs meaningless. But one rainy afternoon, Daniel arrived at Ethan's office carrying a thick file that immediately erased any sense of comfort. According to official records, Emma Brooks was not born with that name. Several years earlier, she had legally changed her surname after disappearing from the community where she had grown up. Employment records from before that period were unusually difficult to trace. There were long stretches where almost no information existed about her whereabouts. Even more concerning, the references listed on her application to work at Ethan's mansion contained small inconsistencies. Nothing suggested criminal behavior, but enough details failed to match official records to raise serious concerns. Daniel made one thing clear before leaving Ethan's office. He wasn't saying Emma was dangerous. He was saying she had deliberately hidden part of her past, and people rarely did that without believing they had no other choice. The report left Ethan emotionally exhausted. For 2 days, he carried the file everywhere without opening it again. He wanted to confront Emma, yet another part of him feared the answer. Finally, one quiet evening after the household staff had finished cleaning the kitchen, he asked Emma to sit down. The warmth that had always filled their conversations disappeared almost instantly when Ethan placed the investigation file on the table between them. He spoke calmly, explaining the anonymous photographs, the hidden identity, and the unanswered questions that had forced him to seek the truth. Emma's face turned pale the moment she saw the file. For several long seconds, she simply stared at it without saying a word. Ethan waited, hoping she would explain everything, hoping there would be a reasonable answer that would allow them to move forward. Instead, Emma quietly lowered her eyes and whispered only one sentence. "I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you would never believe me." Ethan asked who she really was. He asked why she had changed her name. He asked who the man in the photographs was. Emma's lips trembled as tears filled her eyes, but she refused to answer any of the questions. She only repeated that she could not explain, not yet. The silence between them became unbearable. Ethan felt betrayed, not because he knew the truth, but because she wouldn't trust him enough to share it. With a heavy heart and believing he had no other choice, he told Emma that she could no longer continue working at the mansion until everything was explained. She accepted his decision without anger, quietly removed her apron, thanked the kitchen staff for their kindness, and walked out of the mansion carrying the same 2 suitcases she had arrived with only weeks earlier. The house immediately returned to the lifeless silence Ethan remembered so well. Dinner was once again prepared by temporary staff, but every meal tasted empty. The kitchen, once filled with conversation and laughter, became another quiet room inside an enormous mansion. Ethan told himself he had done the responsible thing, yet the decision brought no peace. 3 days after Emma left, his household manager informed him that one of the kitchen lockers still contained several personal belongings she had accidentally forgotten. Expecting little more than cooking utensils, Ethan unlocked the compartment himself. Inside lay a neatly folded apron, a worn recipe notebook, a silver necklace, and an old photograph tucked inside a faded envelope. The moment Ethan picked up the necklace, his hands began to shake. It wasn't just similar to one his late mother had owned. It was the exact necklace she wore almost every day during his childhood. There was no mistake. He remembered fastening the delicate clasp around her neck as a little boy before family gatherings. He had searched for it after her passing, but assumed it had been lost forever. Beneath the necklace rested a sealed, handwritten letter addressed simply to Ethan. The handwriting looked strangely familiar. With trembling hands, he unfolded the first page and read the opening words that instantly changed everything he thought he knew. If you're reading this, it means the truth has finally found you before I could. In that single moment, Ethan realized Emma's greatest secret wasn't about stealing from him, deceiving him, or chasing his fortune. It was connected to someone he had loved his entire life, and whatever waited inside the rest of that letter had the power to rewrite his family's history forever. Ethan Cole barely noticed the sunrise. He had spent the entire night sitting alone in his late mother's study. The handwritten letter spread across the same wooden desk where she had once balanced household bills long before his companies were worth billions. Every sentence answered one question while creating three more. The letter revealed that nearly 25 years earlier, before Ethan's father had become financially successful, his parents had quietly supported a struggling single mother and her young daughter through one of the darkest seasons of their lives. They had paid overdue rent without expecting repayment, covered medical expenses after a serious accident, and even arranged for the little girl to attend a culinary summer program because she loved cooking more than anything else. His mother had written that true generosity should never be used to make someone feel indebted. She wanted the family to move forward with dignity, not gratitude. She ended that part of the letter with a sentence Ethan could barely read through his tears. If fate ever brings that little girl back into your life, I hope you see her heart before you see her circumstances. That little girl was Emma Brooks. Suddenly, the familiar recipes, the comforting meals, and the warmth Ethan had felt every evening no longer seemed like impossible coincidences. Emma had learned many of those recipes directly from the woman Ethan had loved most in the world. She hadn't copied them. She had been taught with kindness, patience, and affection by the very person Ethan missed every single day. But the second half of the letter changed the story entirely. His mother's handwriting became noticeably more urgent as she described a disagreement that had taken place within the Cole family shortly before her death. Ethan had always believed his parents built their fortune honestly with the support of close relatives. Yet the letter suggested something very different. According to his mother, one branch of the family had quietly manipulated legal documents involving inherited land that later became the foundation of several enormously valuable commercial developments. She never accused anyone of theft directly, but she admitted she had gathered evidence because she feared innocent people had been cheated out of what rightfully belonged to them. Before she could confront those responsible, illness overtook her, and she entrusted copies of certain documents to someone she believed would protect them until the right moment arrived. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized who that person had been. Emma's mother. The woman his parents had once helped had secretly become the guardian of evidence capable of exposing one of the wealthiest families in America. Emma hadn't changed her name to hide from Ethan. She had changed it because people connected to that inheritance dispute had spent years searching for anyone who might possess those documents. She wasn't protecting herself alone. She was protecting her late mother's final promise. Determined to find Emma before anyone else reached her, Ethan drove to the modest apartment where she had been living since joining the mansion staff. The drive that normally took 40 minutes felt endless. Every traffic light became another reminder that he had misunderstood the woman who had only ever shown him kindness. When he finally arrived, something immediately felt wrong. The building manager recognized Ethan from television and reluctantly informed him that Emma had moved out before sunrise. Her rent had been paid in full, her furniture removed, and no forwarding address had been left behind. The apartment door stood open, revealing empty rooms where only days earlier a quiet life had existed. The walls were bare. The kitchen shelves were empty. The small dining table where she had often tested new recipes was gone. It looked as though she had vanished overnight. Ethan searched every room one final time before noticing a single folded piece of paper resting on the windowsill. It wasn't addressed to him. It was an old grocery list written in Emma's handwriting, but on the back she had scribbled one heartbreaking sentence. Some people lose everything because they stay. Others lose everything because they leave. I hope I made the right choice. Ethan folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket, realizing she hadn't disappeared because she feared him. She had disappeared because she believed staying would place him in even greater danger. As Ethan walked back toward his car, his phone rang. It was Daniel Mercer, the investigator whose voice now carried an urgency Ethan had never heard before. Daniel had uncovered financial records linking one of Ethan's own relatives to private investigators hired over several years to locate Emma's family. Even more alarming, surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed two unfamiliar vehicles following Emma's moving truck as it left the city that morning. Whoever had mailed the anonymous photographs hadn't been trying to destroy Ethan's relationship with Emma. They had been warning him that someone else was already closing in. Daniel's final words stopped Ethan in his tracks. This was never about your money, Ethan. It was always about those documents. If the wrong people find Emma before you do, she'll never get the chance to tell her side of the story. Ethan looked back one last time at the empty apartment before climbing into his car. For the first time in years, billion-dollar board meetings, stock prices, and corporate victories meant absolutely nothing. Somewhere on an American highway, the woman he loved was running from a past she never created, carrying secrets powerful enough to shake his family's legacy to its foundation. Ethan turned the key in the ignition with only one thought filling his mind. He wasn't chasing a chef anymore. He was racing against time to save the only person who had ever made his mansion feel like home before those hunting the truth reach her first. For nearly 3 weeks, Ethan Cole disappeared from the public eye. Financial reporters speculated that the billionaire was negotiating another historic business acquisition. Investors wondered why he had postponed important meetings. His company's board of directors quietly grew concerned as one of the most disciplined executives in America suddenly stopped behaving like himself. The truth was far different from anything the business world imagined. Ethan wasn't sitting inside a skyscraper negotiating billion-dollar contracts. He was driving through small towns, speaking with restaurant owners, visiting farmers markets, and following the smallest clues left behind by a woman who had never asked him for anything except honesty. Daniel Mercer remained by his side, carefully tracing every lead connected to Emma Brooks. Every new town offered another dead end. Another person who vaguely remembered a talented young chef who stayed only a short while before quietly moving on. It would have been easy to give up, but Ethan couldn't forget the letter written by his mother or the final note Emma had left behind. For the first time in his life, success wasn't measured by profit margins or stock prices. It was measured by whether he could reach one person before those determined to silence her forever. The search finally ended in a quiet coastal town in Oregon, where tourists rarely stopped and everyone seemed to know one another by name. Daniel had received a phone call from an elderly cafe owner who recognized Emma from one of the discreet photographs investigators had circulated. Ethan walked into the small family restaurant expecting another disappointment, but instead he saw her standing behind a simple wooden counter, wearing the same calm expression she always carried inside the mansion. She looked up as the bell above the door rang, and for several long seconds neither of them spoke. The restaurant faded into silence as memories rushed back between them. Emma slowly removed her apron and walked toward him, her eyes filled with both relief and sadness. Before Ethan could ask a single question, she quietly apologized for leaving without saying goodbye. She explained that after receiving anonymous threats warning her to stay away from the Cole family, she believed disappearing was the only way to keep him safe. The inheritance documents had remained hidden for years because her mother had honored a promise made to Ethan's late mother. After her mother's passing, Emma inherited not wealth but responsibility. She had spent years avoiding anyone connected to the Cole family because she feared powerful relatives would stop at nothing to recover the evidence. Accepting the position as Ethan's chef had never been part of a plan. She hadn't known whose mansion she would be working in until after signing the employment papers. By then, she believed fate had given her one impossible choice: walk away immediately or protect the truth until the right moment arrived. She chose silence because she thought it would spare Ethan from becoming involved. Ethan listened without interrupting, realizing how unfairly he had judged her. He admitted that fear had clouded his judgment and that years of betrayal had taught him to question everyone, even the one person who had given him genuine peace. Emma handed him a weathered envelope she had protected for years. Inside were copies of financial records, handwritten correspondence, and legal documents proving that several members of Ethan's extended family had manipulated inheritance agreements decades earlier. Armed with the evidence, Ethan refused to bury the truth simply to protect the family's reputation. Instead, he turned everything over to federal authorities and independent attorneys. The investigation that followed lasted several months and attracted national attention. Respected newspapers covered the case as one of the largest inheritance fraud investigations involving a prominent American family in years. Several relatives faced serious legal consequences, hidden financial assets were recovered, and charitable foundations established by Ethan's parents finally received property that had been wrongfully withheld for decades. Reporters expected Ethan to celebrate the legal victory, but he rarely commented publicly. When he finally addressed the media, his statement surprised everyone. He said that justice was never about revenge. It was about honoring the people who had chosen integrity when it would have been easier to remain silent. Without mentioning Emma by name, he thanked one courageous individual whose honesty had preserved the truth long after others tried to erase it. Months later, after the investigations had ended and life slowly returned to normal, Ethan returned to the same little restaurant where he had found Emma. This time there were no investigators, no lawyers, and no unanswered questions waiting between them. Only two people who had survived a journey neither had expected. Ethan asked Emma to take a walk along the quiet shoreline after closing time. As the sun disappeared beyond the Pacific Ocean, he told her that every business achievement in his life suddenly felt insignificant compared to what she had taught him. She had reminded him that trust could still exist in a world obsessed with wealth, that kindness often came from those with the least to gain, and that love was measured by sacrifice rather than possessions. Then, with the same humility that had always defined him beneath the headlines, Ethan asked Emma to marry him. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't answer immediately. She admitted she was afraid that becoming the wife of one of America's most recognizable billionaires would once again place her under a spotlight she had spent years trying to avoid. Ethan gently took her hands and promised that if she accepted, they would build a life defined not by headlines, but by honesty. He told her he no longer wanted a mansion that felt empty or a fortune that meant nothing without someone to share it with. After a long silence, Emma smiled through her tears and whispered the one word Ethan had hoped to hear: yes. Their wedding took place quietly with close friends, loyal employees, and a handful of people who had stood beside them when the future seemed uncertain. There were no extravagant television specials, no celebrity guest lists, and no unnecessary displays of wealth. Instead, the celebration reflected the values that had brought them together in the first place. The mansion that had once echoed with loneliness slowly transformed into a true home. The grand dining room was no longer reserved for formal occasions because most evenings Ethan preferred sitting in the kitchen while Emma prepared dinner, just as she had on the night everything changed. Laughter replaced silence. Family traditions replaced empty routines. Employees who had once viewed the mansion as another workplace now described it as the happiest home they had ever worked in. Visitors often noticed that despite owning priceless artwork and breathtaking architecture, Ethan's favorite place remained the kitchen, where one ordinary meal had rewritten the course of his life. Looking back, Ethan often realized that becoming a billionaire had never been the greatest achievement of his life. Wealth had given him comfort, opportunity, and influence, but it could never have taught him the lessons Emma did. She showed him that loyalty cannot be purchased, integrity cannot be inherited, and genuine love never measures a person's value by the size of a bank account. Sometimes life changes because of $1 billion decision. Sometimes it changes because of a single conversation. And sometimes, as Ethan Cole discovered, everything begins with one unforgettable meal prepared by someone whose heart was far richer than any fortune on earth. If this story reminded you that love, honesty, and compassion remain life's greatest treasures, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Story Chamber so you never miss another unforgettable journey. Until next time, remember that the richest life isn't built by the money we collect, but by the people we choose to trust, the promises we choose to keep, and the love we never stop believing in.